It began as nothing more than a fleeting moment, something so innocent I didn't even give it a second thought. But now, looking back, I realize just how close I came to crossing a line I never imagined approaching. The craziest part, my husband noticed. He didn't just notice, he encouraged it. At first, I thought it was some sort of test, or maybe even a joke. But as things unfolded, I realized there was something much deeper going on. There's a man, let's call him Ethan. He's been a family friend for years. Charming, easygoing, the kind of person who can light up a room without even trying. I'll admit, there's always been a certain energy between us, but I'd always dismissed it as harmless chemistry. After all, I'm married, and happily so. But then Ethan started making comments, little things that felt just a touch too personal, a bit too familiar. "You're glowing today," he'd say, his eyes lingering a moment longer than necessary. Or, "I wish my girlfriend laughed at my jokes the way you do." At first, I laughed it off, attributing it to his playful nature. But then my husband, Mark, noticed, and his reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of being jealous or annoyed, Mark seemed intrigued. "Ethan's got good taste," he joked one night as we cleaned up after a dinner party. I laughed, but there was something in his tone, a curiosity, maybe even excitement, that stayed with me. And that's when it all began. What started as innocent teasing turned into something far more complicated. Mark began encouraging me to dress up more when Ethan was around, to laugh louder at his jokes, to sit just a little closer during late-night conversations. At first, it felt like a silly game, something harmless. But soon, the boundaries started to blur. One evening, Mark suggested I go out with Ethan to grab supplies for a barbecue we were hosting. "It'll be faster without me," he said casually. But the look in his eyes told a different story. That's when I started questioning everything. Was this really just Mark being confident in our relationship, or was there something else at play? During that car ride with Ethan, something happened. A moment so small, it felt insignificant, but it changed everything. We got into the car, the cool evening air wrapping around us, and I couldn't shake a strange tension in the atmosphere. I told myself I was imagining it. This was Ethan. We'd shared countless laughs and memories, always with Mark or other friends present. This wasn't any different, right? At first, the drive was uneventful, filled with light conversation about the barbecue and what snacks to buy. But as we pulled into the store parking lot, Ethan turned to me with his signature grin. "You know," he said, his voice soft but assured, "you've been different lately, in a good way." I froze, unsure how to respond. "Different? How so?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, his gaze holding mine a beat too long. "I don't know. Happier, lighter. Whatever it is, it suits you." I laughed nervously and quickly got out of the car, brushing off his comment. But inside, something shifted, a mix of flattery and unease. Was it wrong that his words made me feel noticed? Inside the store, Ethan stayed close. Too close. At one point, as we both reached for a bag of chips, our hands brushed. He didn't pull away right away, and neither did I. It was such a small thing, but it lingered in my mind as we checked out and headed back to the car. On the drive home, Ethan turned the conversation to Mark. "He's a lucky guy," he said, glancing at me with a knowing smile. "Not every husband would be so chill about, well, us hanging out like this." A knot tightened in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "I just mean some guys might get jealous, but not Mark. He's cool with it. It's kind of refreshing." The word refreshing hung in the air, its implications twisting in my mind. Was Mark really as okay with this as Ethan thought? Or was there something deeper going on that I hadn't realized? When we got back to the house, Mark was waiting on the porch, a beer in hand, and that same curious look in his eyes. "How was the trip?" he asked casually, though his gaze flicked between me and Ethan like he was trying to decipher some hidden message. "It was fine," I said quickly, rushing past him and into the house. But I could feel their eyes on me, the tension between us crackling like static electricity. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Mark," I said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" He turned to me, his expression calm but attentive. "Of course." I took a deep breath. "Why did you want me to go with Ethan today? Alone?" Mark smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I trust you," he said simply, "and I trust him." For a moment, I felt relieved. But then he added something that left me reeling. "And honestly, I think it's good for you." His words echoed in my mind long after he said them. Good for me. What did that even mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't telling me everything, but I wasn't ready to press him. Not yet. The next few days were strangely normal, or at least they seemed to be. Mark carried on as if nothing had changed, but I found myself hyper-aware of every word Ethan said and every gesture he made when he was around. It was like I was seeing him through a different lens, one that made everything feel charged. One evening, we hosted another casual dinner with friends, a typical gathering with food, drinks, and laughter. But this time, the atmosphere felt heavier, as though something unspoken was simmering just beneath the surface. Ethan arrived late, as usual, and the moment he walked in, his eyes immediately found mine. I felt it instantly, that same charged energy I'd been trying so hard to ignore. Mark noticed it too. "Ethan!" he called out, waving him over. "You've got to try the ribs. They're her best yet." He emphasized her, and I felt my cheeks flush. As the evening went on, I caught Ethan sneaking glances at me more than once. At one point, while I was in the kitchen uncorking a bottle of wine, he followed me in. "You're avoiding me," he said, leaning casually against the counter. I laughed nervously, keeping my eyes focused on the wine bottle. "I'm not avoiding you. Don't be ridiculous. He stepped closer, his voice softening. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's bothering you. I finally looked up, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The way he was looking at me, intense, searching, made it impossible to pretend anymore. Nothing's bothering me, I said quickly, turning away. But my heart was racing, and I knew he could tell. Before either of us could say more, Mark walked in, his timing almost suspiciously perfect. There you are, he said, his tone light, though his eyes were sharp. Everything okay in here? Of course, I replied with a forced smile, but the tension in the room was palpable, and I could tell Mark felt it too. That night, after everyone had left, Mark and I sat together on the couch in silence. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to speak. Finally, he broke the quiet. You and Ethan, he began, his voice calm but deliberate. You're close, aren't you? I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. We're friends, I said carefully. Why? He shrugged, his gaze locked on mine. I just think it's interesting, the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. My stomach flipped. What's that supposed to mean? Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It means maybe you should explore it, see what happens. I stared at him, stunned. Are you serious? His expression remained steady. All I'm saying is, life's too short to ignore the things that make you feel alive. I didn't know how to respond. Was this a test? Permission? A trap? Either way, I knew nothing would be the same after this. The following days felt like walking a tightrope. Every glance between Ethan and me felt charged, loaded with an unspoken understanding. And yet, I had no idea how far either of us was willing to go. Mark's words kept echoing in my mind. Life's too short to ignore the things that make you feel alive. It wasn't just a passing comment, it felt like an invitation. But to what? I tried to push it aside, throwing myself into work, chores, and preparing for our next barbecue. But no matter how hard I focused, my mind kept drifting back to that night, to Ethan, to the way he looked at me, to how his presence seemed to draw something out of me that I couldn't fully define. The following weekend, Mark and I attended a friend's wedding. It was the kind of event where everyone was expected to be on their best behavior, but instead, it made me feel even more on edge. Ethan was there, of course, as charming and magnetic as always, joking, making people laugh. But every time our eyes met, the tension was undeniable. I found myself watching him more than I should have, captivated by the way he moved, by the subtle changes in his voice when he spoke to me. At one point, I excused myself to get a drink at the bar, and before I realized it, Ethan was beside me. You okay? He asked, his voice low and a little too close. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure why I felt so nervous. Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day. He smiled, that familiar, mischievous smile that always made my heart race. Well, we should change that, shouldn't we? He gestured to the empty balcony outside. Come take a breath with me. I think you need a break from all these people. I hesitated, Was this a casual suggestion or something more? Was I reading too much into it? Or was I denying what was happening right in front of me? I glanced back at Mark, who was across the room, chatting and laughing with friends. He didn't notice me slip away with Ethan. We stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air calming the butterflies in my stomach. Ethan leaned against the railing, and I joined him, standing just close enough to feel the warmth of his body beside me. "You look stunning tonight," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. I forced a smile, not trusting my voice. "Thanks." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something unspoken. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't undo, and yet I couldn't bring myself to step back. Ethan's gaze locked with mine, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. The way he looked at me, no words, just an intense connection, made the world around us seem to disappear. Before I could react, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "You know, I think Mark knows." I froze. "What?" "He's not blind," Ethan continued, his eyes still fixed on mine. "He sees the way we're drawn to each other. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" My pulse quickened. This was it, the moment where everything changed. Was this a test? A temptation? Or was I actually about to cross the line? Just as I was about to respond, Mark's voice called out from inside. "Hey babe, you coming back in?" His words jolted me back to reality, my heart racing in my chest. Ethan stepped away from the railing, his smile fading into something I couldn't quite decipher. "Go ahead," he said softly. "I'll see you inside." I walked back into the room, my mind spinning with confusion. What had just happened? And why did it feel like everything had shifted beneath my feet? The real question, though, was whether Mark knew exactly what was going on, or if he'd been playing his own game all along. The following week was a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the wedding night in my mind. Ethan's words, the way his touch lingered, and the look in his eyes as I walked away. I tried to act normal, but a heavy tension hung in the air between Mark and me. Every time I caught him looking at me, it felt like he could see straight through me, as though he knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. One afternoon, Mark and I were lounging on the couch, flipping through TV channels, when he brought it up casually. "So, how was your little chat with Ethan the other night?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, not meeting my gaze. "You know, the balcony, the drinks. You two looked pretty cozy out there." I stared at him, stunned. He knew. I didn't know how or when, but I could tell from the way he said it, so calm, so nonchalant, that he'd seen everything. My stomach churned. Was this some kind of test, or had I been walking into something far more complicated than I realized? I didn't answer right away. unsure of what to say. Instead, I just watched him, trying to read his expression. Was he angry? Suspicious? Hurt? But Mark simply smiled, that same easy, familiar smile, as if he were waiting for me to piece it all together. "You know I'm not stupid," he said, his tone light, though his eyes were sharp. "I saw the way you looked at him. I saw the way he looked at you." A chill ran through me. He had seen it all. "Mark," I began, unsure of how to handle this. Was he upset? Was he about to confront me? But before I could continue, he raised a hand to stop me. "I'm not angry, if that's what you're thinking," he said gently. "I told you before, I trust you, and I trust him." He exhaled deeply before continuing. "But there's something about this. The way things are shifting, it's exciting." I was floored. Exciting? Was this all just a twisted thrill for him? How had we gotten to this point? Was it a game to him? To both of them? "You know," he continued, his voice calm, "there's something to be said for feeling wanted, for feeling alive. I see the way Ethan looks at you, and I see how you react to it. It's kind of beautiful in its own way." I was speechless. My thoughts raced. Was he genuinely encouraging this? Was he pushing me toward Ethan without me even realizing it? Or was I just reading too much into his words? "I'm not asking you to do anything you don't want to do," Mark added, noticing the confusion on my face. "I just want you to know that whatever happens, I'm okay with it." I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my thoughts tangled in knots. I thought I understood Mark. I thought I knew where he stood. But now, everything felt upside down. What was he really asking of me? What was I asking of myself? That night, after Mark fell asleep, I lay awake in the dark, my mind buzzing. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. How easy it was to slip into that space with him. How it felt like something unspoken was simmering beneath the surface. And then there was Mark, who seemed to be orchestrating this entire situation, like a conductor of some strange, emotional symphony. But what did it all mean? The next day, Ethan called me. At first, it was an innocent conversation. He asked how my week was going and talked about plans for the weekend. But then, in his usual playful tone, he said, "So, when's Mark going to let me take you out on a real date, huh?" I laughed awkwardly, but the pause that followed was thick with tension I couldn't ignore. "You know," Ethan continued, his voice turning serious, "I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about how things are, and how we've been dancing around it for a while." My heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though I already knew. There was a long silence before he finally replied. "You know what I mean. This thing between us, the chemistry, the attraction." A rush of heat spread across my face. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. How was I supposed to respond? I don't think we should talk about this, I said quickly, trying to retreat. It's complicated. It doesn't have to be, Ethan said softly, almost coaxing. It's just us, and I think you can feel it too. The weight of his words settled over me. Was he right? Was this inevitable? And more importantly, was I ready to face the consequences of stepping into something I couldn't undo? The days that followed felt like a slow, inevitable countdown to something I wasn't sure I could stop. I couldn't get Ethan's voice out of my head. His words replayed over and over, leaving me trapped in a web of emotions I didn't know how to untangle. It felt like Ethan was daring me to admit what had been simmering between us, while Mark behaved as though everything was perfectly normal. The game Mark seemed to be orchestrating was one I couldn't fully understand, but its intensity grew with every passing moment. Everything came to a head on a Saturday night. Mark had planned a quiet evening for the two of us, just movies and relaxation, but I knew Ethan would be coming by. He had texted earlier, asking if he could stop over for a quick drink after work. I had nearly convinced myself not to overthink it. After all, it was just a casual drink, right? But when Ethan walked in, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Mark greeted him like any other guest, his demeanor friendly and easygoing as usual. Still, there was something beneath his smile, something I couldn't quite pinpoint. I felt it in the way they both carried themselves, as though they were actors in this strange, unspoken play. The question was, who was I? The one stuck in the middle, unsure where my loyalty lay, or the one giving in to temptation? As the evening unfolded, the tension only grew thicker. Mark leaned back in his chair, cracking jokes, appearing completely at ease. Ethan, too, was his usual charming self, but every glance between us, every brief touch, every moment our eyes lingered a second too long, sent shivers through me, both unsettling and thrilling. Finally, after his third drink, Ethan stood to leave. I should probably head out, he said casually, but there was an unfinished edge to his tone. His eyes met mine as he stood at the door, and in that moment, I knew exactly what he was going to say. Can I talk to you for a minute? He asked, his voice low. Mark was in the other room, and before I could respond, Ethan stepped closer. My throat tightened. What is it? I managed to ask. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze intense enough to make my heart race. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, I can't stop thinking about you. I need to know, do you feel the same way, or am I just wasting my time? I froze. My thoughts were spinning wildly. Mark was just in the next room, completely unaware of what was unfolding. The guilt hit me hard, but beneath it was a rush of something else, something I didn't want to name. Ethan wasn't being subtle anymore. He was laying everything bare. Ethan, I don't know, I stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. This is wrong. He shook his head. Is it? Is it really? Or is it just what we've been told to believe? What everyone expects us to do? His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and the simple contact felt like the world had tilted. I pulled my hand back quickly, taking a step away. We can't do this, I whispered. Not like this. But even as I said it, part of me wasn't so sure. The pull between us was undeniable, growing stronger with every passing second. Was I really about to walk away from it? The door to the living room creaked open, and I turned to see Mark standing there, watching us. His expression was unreadable, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Disappointment? Amusement? Everything okay? Mark asked, his voice calm, like he was addressing an old friend. But there was an unmistakable tension beneath his words. I turned fully to face him, guilt flooding through me. Yeah, just talking, I said, forcing my voice to stay even. Mark nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to Ethan. Well, we should probably call it a night. Early day tomorrow. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Ethan gave me one last lingering look before stepping out the door. The house felt unbearably heavy after it closed behind him, like I was trapped in a silent battle. The pull I felt toward Ethan was overwhelming, but Mark's presence weighed just as heavily. He knew, he hadn't said it outright, but I could feel it in the way he moved, the way he watched me. When Mark reappeared, he sat down beside me on the couch, his eyes sharp and focused. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like he was truly studying me, peeling back every layer I had so carefully constructed. So, Mark said quietly, what do you want to do now? The question hung in the air, unanswered. I couldn't find the words. How could I undo what had already started? The truth was, I couldn't. And the scariest part, I wasn't sure I even wanted to.